Cameron will go through them after the end of her presentation and ask her questions, ask the questions. Please leave the questions out of chat, just because it's harder to parse through those, but just add to the Q&A, and at the end of the presentation, we'll ask Bet the questions. All right, that's it. Take it away, Bet.
Oh, good. Well, I'm really glad to be with you all. I'm coming to you from beautiful Bend, Oregon. And so today it's still light here, and we're finishing up our day out here. But I am a little bit about me. I've been a WordPress user since 2008. I've helped develop over 150 sites. I am into a geek about accessibility and gravity forms. I love both of those things. I currently serve as the CEO at BH Business Websites. That's where Laura works. That's how she got me here. She's our content manager. And you can find me at Bet Hannon on Twitter if you want to reach out, and or you can go to our website. I have that on the last slide too. And so we're going to talk today about the business case for accessibility. I'm going to get my and I'll just start by telling you all a little bit about how we got interested in accessibility. We had almost 4 years ago now, a client, a large water district in California, that we had been working with them on their site for quite some time. And they came to us and let us know that they were aware that they had some new legal requirements around website accessibility and wanted us to help them with that. And we didn't know a lot about accessibility then, and they didn't either, but we all dived in and learned a lot. And we all got hooked on our team, got hooked with around website accessibility, and became really passionate about making the web as widely available to as many people as possible. And I'm not the most technical person about website accessibility, but I do think that we should be all talking about why we should be making our websites accessible. And I hope that's what we're going to do tonight. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in the US, estimates that about 25% of all adults in the US have either a permanent or a temporary disability. So a permanent disability might be either you were born blind or you became blind and there's not any chance that you're going to recover your vision. You're permanently blind. But you can have a temporary disability too. I had surgery on both my thumbs within an 18-month period one time. And so for a while, I wasn't able to use a mouse. And so I had a temporary disability. Disabilities we know increase with age. We can think about visual acuity decreases. And so if you start to think about this, we know the population in the United States is getting older over time. So the percentage of us with disabilities is likely to also go up. So we want to kind of be thinking about that. That's a lot of people, really. 25% is 1 in 4 people. So that's affecting a lot of people. So website accessibility is something that we want to think about as not just affecting a small group of people. So when I go to networking events and I tell people I run an agency that focuses on website accessibility, you can almost see this little cartoon thought bubbles in people's heads and they get confused. And in one bubble is a website and in the other bubble is a wheelchair, and they're just not quite certain how that all goes together. And so just to make sure that we're all on the same page as we talk about accessibility tonight, what I want to do is sort of recap a little bit about what is website accessibility, give you just a couple of really brief tips about along the way about how to make your site a little more accessible. Because I think when you understand what website accessibility is, then you can be more passionate and more committed to it and work at making your site accessible along the way. So website accessibility gives people with diverse abilities equal access, equal opportunity to access web content. It's really kind of as simple as that. So here's an example. If you are a person who has severe visual disabilities and maybe even total blindness, there are tools like screen readers that will enable you to will read out loud the content of websites for you. They will read things out and make that content accessible to you if that content, and it will work if that content is properly formatted. One of the older screen reader technologies is called JAWS, and a license for JAWS can cost you about $1,000 a year. So it's not cheap to have disabilities, for sure. Newer screen reader, NVDA, is open source and free. You can see the little free sticker there. You can go to the NVDA website. You can download the NVDA software onto your computer and run it to see what a screen reader is like. If you do that, I would encourage you, they invite you to make a small donation. Even if you're going to give them $10, they are doing some amazing work in developing nations and across the whole world at helping all kinds of people who would not have access otherwise to something like JAWS to be able to access screen readers, get on the internet, and improve the lives of those people and their families all around. So I encourage you to make a small donation. I have a kind of a little briefing video about how screen readers work. And I think once the light bulb goes on about how the screen reader works, it gives you some better ideas for understanding how making your site accessible is important. So I am sharing my screen. Oh, I think I have to stop the share and come back to make sure I get the audio on there. Share with sound. Sorry about that.
Sure, I'll let you know if there's anything.
Yeah, do let me know if it doesn't come through.
This is Mark Sutton from the University of California, San Francisco's IT Web Services Department. Here today with a brief tour of screen reading technology. I'm a blind person who has been using screen readers, braille writers, scanning equipment, other adaptive technologies since my childhood. What a screen reader does is, for example, I'm going to start to read this page.
Navigation volume. Link, University of California, San Francisco. Link, about UCSF. Link, search UCSF.
And what I will now do is slow down the speech rate.
Rating percent. 75%, 70%, 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%. Link, UCSF Medical Center.
So as I was about to say, a screen reader converts what's on a computer screen into information that can be displayed through synthetic speech or braille output. And it does that by allowing you to use a computer instead of a mouse, a computer keyboard instead of a mouse. You can also use a braille display as an input device.
End of navigation.
And what it does is it cleverly determines what's on the screen and presents you that information in a way that would allow for efficient navigation of these pages. So for example, I could just keep reading.
Banner 3 items. Visited, link, image, home.
Line by line, and we could be here all day. Or I could jump to the first heading on the page.
Heading level 2, search for heading level 2. You are here. Heading level 1, make videos accessible.
So as I'm moving down through the page, I can look for the category that interests me. And I'm just using commands built into the screen reader. So that's all a pretty simple description of what a screen reader is all about. Now I'm going to go over and show a few examples of how that can fall apart. So I have a couple graphics on this page.
Mark Sutton hands on a MacBook Pro image.
So the first one is well described and uses an alt tag.
You are currently on it.
To describe what that graphic is all about. Now we go to the next graphic.
Reader 042116.jpg.
Much less useful. So it's important to use those elements. It's also true for tables. So I'm going to move to a table.
FDA approved medications. Table, 3 columns, 5 rows. FDA approved medications.
Table. So the table is pretty self-explanatory, and I'm going to move into the table.
Medicine. Approved. Column 2 of 3.
And then if I go down into the table.
Medicine. Tolbutamide.
And as I move across.
Approved. 1975. Column 2 of 3.
We're getting the labels for the column headers and row headers. So it's important when programming tables, forms, and other elements on the web pages to use the proper HTML codes.
I'm going to stop him right there. he goes on a little bit to talk a little bit more specifically about tables, but you get the picture that these screen readers really are life-changing for people with disabilities, with visual disabilities, and there are other technologies too. As you could see, the screen reader is heavily dependent on keyboard. It's keyboard driven. And there are lots of little shortcuts for navigating around the page. And that's true for other adaptive devices as well. You can actually start testing the accessibility of your keyboard, of your website, by just going to your website and using only the tab and enter key. And if you didn't already know, if you press shift tab, then that takes you back through content through the tab key, but just try navigating around your website using just the tab and enter keys. And if you're, it's not just screen readers that use these keyboards. If you are not able to use your a mouse with your hands, there are all kinds of devices. Like Stephen Hawking had a little device on his cheek, on his glasses, to detect cheek movements. Other people's use eye tracking. All of that really just depends on having these, having the text set up properly. So here are my two tips for website accessibility. The first one is to use what's called semantic markup, and the other to use alt tags. So as you may have gathered when Mark Sutton was going through that page, he was tabbing through to all of the H2 to the H2 things, and that's actually a very common way that people with visual disabilities kind of scan through the page, just like a sighted person might sort of scan and look at the headings. People do that with screen readers too. And so you want to make sure that you have those labeled properly. WordPress always makes the page title the H1, and you only want one H1 on the page. And then the next kind of major section of things is an H2, and then you put an H3 under that, kind of nest it in its subsections, but you would never want to skip, for example, from an H2 to an H4. And sometimes if people don't understand what those headings are for, in terms of things like that semantic markup, then maybe they're just using that to style the text. They like the H5, the way the H5 font looks, and so they're putting that up next to an H2. And you don't want to do that. You want to make sure you're running to H2, H3, H3, H4, and then back out so that it's all properly nested. And then alt tags, as you saw, is what the screen reader reads out loud for folks. So you want that to be descriptive. You want to make sure that it's not just photo or just the title of the file. You don't have to put anything in there about it being an image. The screen reader will do that. It automatically appends that onto the description, but you'll want to make sure that you use alt tags on your images. Those are two huge pieces of accessibility. And as you can see from just those things, those are all content driven. So you'll have to work with the people who are putting in content on the site to make sure they understand how these two things work in terms of accessibility. Now, there are a lot of other disabilities. I've just touched on two, really. Visual disabilities and mobility disabilities are just two of them. You might also need to think about things like color blindness and good color contrast between the background and the font color, the needs of people who are deaf. If you have videos on the website, you'll need to make sure they have captions or a transcript. You'll want to make sure that things are not flashing or strobing that might introduce seizures. You'll want to think about, how many clicks are you making people work? People with anxiety or who have ADHD will give up too quickly if it's too complicated to get to the content. So all of those things you're thinking about. If you want to learn more about the technical pieces of SEO, more about those kinds of implementation of accessibility, you can go to WordPress TV. WordPress.tv is the domain where Most of the recordings that are presentations are given at WordCamps are available, and you can search them, and you can search and watch the ones on accessibility, and they have a lot of tips about how to make your site more accessible. And the place you want to go for the kind of standards and guidelines for accessibility is called the WCAG, Website Content Accessibility Guidelines. There are 3 levels to that, single A, double A, triple A. Most of the time, people are focused on double A compliance, and that's a great place to start in terms of learning more about the implementations for accessibility. So the title of this talk is about the business case for accessibility, but I just want to sort of lay out there that there is, of course, a moral case for accessibility. Accessibility, making the web, making your website accessible is the right thing to do. It's a case of, treat other people how you would like to be treated. And within the WordPress community, we sometimes talk about democratizing publishing, and it's not that big a step from democratizing publishing to democratizing access, making the web and its content and even the ability to create content on the web accessible for everybody. If you think about how much of our lives today involve the internet, and website accessibility is what enables people with disabilities to live independently and with human dignity without having to depend on family members or friends or even strangers in some cases for the most basic help in accessing content and services. Accessibility is just the right thing to do. And in fact, the title of this talk, The Business Case for Accessibility, is probably offensive to a lot of disabled people. It's sort of an if it makes sense to do financially, I should do it. And that's not at all what I'm meaning here. I really don't want to suggest that we should not be making the moral case for accessibility, and we should definitely be doing that. And we need to keep doing it. But the reality is that sometimes when the competing factors and interests of time and money come into play, and it usually does take additional time and effort and potentially money to keep your site accessible, not everyone is swayed by the moral case for accessibility. So I think we need to talk about the business case for accessibility and about how making the websites that we build and that we run is good for business and good for the bottom line. So I'm going to lay out some reasons why you might want to make your site accessible beyond the moral case for accessibility. There are services out there where you can pay good money to increase the traffic to your website by 5%. And 5% is a great goal. And who wouldn't want to increase the traffic to their website? But if you could increase the traffic to your website potentially by 20 or 25% by putting accommodations on your website for people with disabilities, why would you not want to do that? Why would you not want to increase the potential audience for your website? People with disabilities have money to spend just like everyone else, and you want to make it easy for them and desirable for them to spend money with you. And don't get hooked in by sort of a specious argument that people with disabilities can't use your product. If you sell hunting rifle scopes, for example, George, who is legally blind, might not be one of your primary customers, but why would you want to prevent him from researching and buying your scopes for people who are in his family? Expand the accessibility of your website and you expand that potential audience, and that's a good thing. You can often improve your SEO. When we talked about adding alt text to images, remember that alt text is what the screen reader reads out loud. But alt text is also what the Google bots index to know what that image is about and to help decide how relevant your content is to particular searches. So screen readers and assistive devices also need to have that semantic markup the headings in the proper order we talked about. And Google uses all of that as well to determine more about your content and whether it's, rank all of your content. So when you add alt tags and you make that headings, you use those heading tags properly, you can make sure that your site is more accessible and give Google more to work with, boosting your SEO. It's a win-win all around. You have no doubt seen curb cuts like this, and they're put into sidewalks to provide access for people who use wheelchairs or use mobility carts, and absolutely they're helpful for people with wheelchairs. And at the same time, anytime I have to pull my luggage around going when I travel, admittedly not that much recently, but when I do, I'm super glad for those curb cuts, right? Because it makes my luggage so much easier to haul around. And people who push kids in strollers are happy for curb cuts. When you make your website accessible, you're going to look at things like how many clicks does it take to get to information, whether colors have enough contrast for good visibility, and everybody will find your website easier to use. You're going to improve the user experience for everybody that comes to your website. Consider, for example, that some of the people who come to your website will not have a disability, but a contextual limitation. Maybe I'm trying to use your website while I'm holding onto a wiggly baby, or I'm trying to look at it on my phone in bright sunlight. An accessible website will make a better user experience for people with contextual limitations like those as well. And when everybody finds your site easier to use, of course, they stay on it, they enjoy that experience more, that increases the chances of them converting into customers. I like to call this the curb cut effect. Let the website accessibility make your website better for everybody. And by the way, all kinds of accommodations and technologies to assist people with disabilities have spilled over from those initial assisting people with disabilities kind of uses into the mainstream to make all of our lives easier already. All of our AI assistants like Alexa and Siri and Google Home all started out as ways to help that AI could help people with disabilities. So you want to make your site accessible and help people with disabilities, but help everybody have a better user experience. So I'm not sure how clear exactly this chart is, but it shows the number of website accessibility lawsuits over recent years. And as you can see, they are dramatically rising. I couldn't find any for 2020 a chart, but the numbers that are coming out is they think that it was somewhere around 20,000 lawsuits were filed in 2020. So dramatically edging up. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, offers legal protections for people with disabilities, but it's not exactly clear yet how ADA relates to websites. The original ADA law was first signed in 1990, before the internet was really such a big part of our lives. And, the most recent administration was not really super excited about any kind of regulatory things. And if we're really honest, neither was the Obama administration before that. And so what's really kind of been left, when the original ADA Act came out, the Department of Justice came out with some guidelines, and it said, you have to have these kind of grab bars in your bathrooms, and you have to have these kind of parking spaces outside your brick and mortar store. And there's not really the equivalent of that for website accessibility. But so what's been left is left for disabled people to bring lawsuits against websites. The very first thing that might happen around a lawsuit is if you get the business receives what's called a demand letter, basically notifying you that there is an accessibility issue on your website. They should be specific about it, and giving you the option to cure that defect. And so if you get a demand letter, it might seem like spam, but definitely do not ignore it. that would be a problem. People, you may have heard about some of the more famous website accessibility lawsuits. There was one with Domino's Pizza that they lost fairly recently. There's also been a suit filed against Beyonce's fan merchandise site. And there are some unfortunate cases where a single attorney and a single disabled person are filing dozens and dozens and dozens of these lawsuits. These are called predatory lawsuits, some of them to make a buck along the way. But those lawsuits are very real. And increasingly, as they're working their way through the courts, the verdicts are coming down on the side of the disabled person. So, and they require not, and so you're paying out not only court cases, but also the cost then to go back and make your website accessible. And I really don't like to fuel fear mongering. I think there are a lot better reasons, business building, business positive reasons to make your website accessible. But if it's the fear of a lawsuit, an expensive lawsuit that really motivates you to get in there and make your website accessible, then great. I have to admit that this may be the biggest ROI factor in terms of making your website accessible. If you may spend money to make your website accessible, but you would spend a lot more money if you got sued. But you know, let the that is a factor in making your website accessible. It's usually cheaper. It's kind of a rule of thumb. It's usually cheaper to keep your current customers than it is to acquire new customers. The likelihood of developing a disability also increases as we age. And those difficulties can start small. So I admit I'm having more and more trouble with small print, and sometimes things just seem too faint to read. But smart businesses want to do the things that will keep their current customers, even when as they might develop disabilities. And they want to make their websites accessible as an investment in retaining customers. Now, if your website is really just essentially a brochure, an online brochure, and there's really not any interaction, then maybe this is not as big a factor for you. But if your customers do any kind of interactions on your website, things like paying for invoices, scheduling services, filling out a contact form, or if your website has, they might reasonably plan to purchase. So for instance, restaurant menus. A lot of times a restaurant website will put up a menu on its website. And this has been the source of several lawsuits recently, has been around, as the disabled person, I want to look at the menu ahead of time so that I know what I'm going to order when I am going to go out with other people. If things like that. So it's the interaction of the customer. It doesn't have to be interactive in a kind of programmable sense, but the interaction with your site for gaining information to make decisions, but also submitting things to you. You need to make those things as accessible as possible. By the way, the same thing can be said for employees as well as customers. If you use a web or computer-based system for employment applications or for performing work in any way, you'll want to make sure those functions are as accessible as possible. And, making your website accessible is an investment in your brand. We all like to feel good about the brands that we associate with. Experts call the people who are conscious about this belief-driven buyers. And if you think about it, we want to buy from the local businesses that invest in the community, and we want to turn away from brands if we discover that they're running a sweatshop. Dan Edelman is a researcher in this area. He estimates that nearly 2/3, 64% of consumers around the world will either buy or boycott from a brand solely because of its position on a social or political issue. That's a lot. And so making a site accessible and then not hesitating to let that be known broadcasts the values of your company about inclusion and making a positive difference in the world. And that can be a significant investment in your brand. And if you think about it, this is not just around with people who have disabilities themselves. When I have a family member or a friend or a loved one that's affected by a disability, then I pay attention to whether they're being included or excluded. I want to be a part of making the world a more welcoming place for them. And more importantly, I care about their human dignity and I want to make them able to live more independently. And when I have a choice between patronizing a company that supports the independence of my disabled friend versus one that doesn't, then all things being equal, I choose the brand that values my friend. Was a little more than a year ago, I had invited a blind contractor to work with us, our team, on a project. And I asked her to schedule some time with us using a Calendly link, calendly.com. She had to come back to me and let me know that she was unable to use it because it was not accessible. I was so deeply embarrassed. And I contacted Calendly and was able to learn that they had already gotten feedback about this from a number of people. And they had some accessibility accommodations in development. And within 3 or 4 months, they were pushing those out on the platform. But if they had not replied, if they had not been willing to make their platform, have accommodations and be accessible, then I would have had to find another scheduling solution, not necessarily because just for that one person, but because I don't want to be a part of supporting things that aren't going to be inclusive in that way. When you invest in your brand by making your site inclusive and accessible, you definitely want to make that known. And primarily, this comes from putting an accessibility policy on your website. So here's an example. If you go to milkbar.com, Milk Bar Store is they sell chocolates and candy, and my mouth is watering already. If you go to their website, you'll see down in the footer, they have just a tiny little link done with like the privacy policy and the terms of service. It's fine down there. Another one that you might want to look at is lukeslobster.com. They have, I think I've misspelled accessibility here maybe, but you want to look at, you can find all kinds of other examples of accessibility policies, and you can go read those specific ones, but generally accessibility policies have 3 separate parts. The first one is a statement that says something like, we want everybody to enjoy and use this website, right? So more of a general statement of inclusivity. And then 2, an acknowledgement of some kind of commitment to WCAG. Often you'll see the WCAG 2.0 AA standards. It's just some kind of a commitment that you've tried to make the website accessible to people with disabilities. And then 3, an acknowledgement that website accessibility is an ongoing work. If you think about every time you add content to your website, you have the potential to make it not accessible anymore. So you have to acknowledge that it's always going to be a work in progress. You invite them to contact you with accessibility issues. And then, of course, if people do contact you with accessibility issues, you have to take those seriously and reply to them and work at fixing them. So we've talked about 6 ways, 6 kind of pieces to the client business case: increasing that potential audience, improving SEO, improving user experience for everybody, avoiding lawsuits, investing in customers, and investing in your brand. And I'm pretty certain that we have some developers among us. So I want to talk a little bit about the developer case for accessibility, or the agency case for accessibility. You'll definitely want to add something on covering liability for accessibility in your contracts, and something that probably acknowledges that accessibility is a moving target and we can't be liable, and all of those things. Consult your attorney. I am not one. But let's just talk a little bit about when you know accessibility, when you understand what the requirements are, when you know how to implement them, when you know how to test for them. That is something that not all developers yet know how to do. And anytime you have someone who has specialized knowledge, whether it's a specialist in SEO or your doctor, right? You pay more for those services. So when you have those skills, it's worth investing in them. You can be able to charge more because you are bringing that increased value to the client. The client might not get sued. The client will be able to have better SEO. The client will, be able to attract more people. All of those things, you'll want to upsell that to the client, as well as, you're there to make that work. My second big tip for developers and agencies is start projects with accessibility in mind, because that's way more cost effective. So then if you just tack it on at the end. So if you think about if you create a mock-up and you get the client and the client approves the mock-up, and then much later, maybe near the end of the project, you realize that the color contrast isn't a high enough ratio, then you've got to go back and get the approval from the client again, and that takes extra time and extra energy and extra money, and it just delays the project. It's not as cost effective. So put the accessibility stuff up first, learn how to develop and put things out accessibly from the beginning, and you'll save yourself a lot of time and money. And finally, for developers, don't ever offer accessibility as an option to be declined on your proposals. Simply make it a non-optional part of everything you do. You do not want to offer your clients the option to save money by excluding people with disabilities. This is an investment in your brand as a developer. You want to stake your values as a developer on inclusion. And just like no self-respecting developer today would launch a website that was not mobile responsive, that's where this is going. You want to learn to make accessibility a part of every single project, because you have the client's best interests in mind, because you want to be a part of making the web more accessible, but because you're committed to doing the best job for that particular client. So accessibility is the right thing to do, but it makes business sense too. And I don't pretend that these are the only end all be all things. And so I'm happy to have questions and conversations. And again, if we don't get to questions in the here on Zoom, feel free to DM me through Twitter or contact me through our website. And happy to talk about accessibility and business.
This was a really great talk. Thank you so much, Bet.
Oh, you're welcome.
And I would throw, as a developer myself, I would throw accessibility in there with as seriously as you take security, as seriously as you take performance, all those things, because they're all related. And I would also even say that accessibility is usability. It's like, as you pointed out, like, yes, it's so people that absolutely need them, need those things in place to access your website, but for people that do not have any issue, like it makes things a lot easier, things more smoother, and it just feels like a better interface in order to just be like, I enjoy working using this website. I'm going to come back.
Well, it's actually a thing. It's kind of like typos in a way, right? If there are no typos, nobody notices that. But once you start having typos in there, it just derails you, right? And you
try that with kerning. Like if you've ever been, I was a copywriter in my previous job, so if I see too much space between letters, I see that, and it annoys you. You say like, there's something wrong with this logo, and you realize that spacing's all messed up.
But it's also important. It's also important once you've made a website accessible and you've handed it off to your client, that you teach your client how to keep it accessible.
Yep.
Primarily adding the alt text to your image. That's the biggest culprit.
Yeah, and there's some great tools for that. There's a couple different plugins now that will you can put a plugin in and it'll show you all the images in the media library, where they're attached, which ones have alt text, which ones don't. There are some tools that will allow you to use AI to try and figure that out, but I would say Laura was coming on to tell me we had one that was a dad and a kid on the beach, and what did it say? Something like scary something. something. And
Oh my gosh, it was hilarious. Yeah, like there is some like AI that will read it, and it literally, it was a dad playing with his son on the beach, and they both had these happy faces, and it was man with scary mask running after killer. And I'm like,
That's amazing.
whoa. So yeah, definitely, like, yeah, that
if you
AI
have
works
things
until it doesn't.
auto-generated like that, be sure you're reading them, right? At least, right?
Yeah,
Like, look at
go,
them.
yeah, for sure, look at them.
Love it.
Yeah.
We at PMC, we've actually we've put in code that you can't insert an image that if it is missing.
Yeah, there are a couple plugins that will do that, and
Mm.
we put in a pro version, but there's one in the repository that has a free level, and I think it's called Accessibility Checker. But whatever, you turn this in, and it's, I don't get into to do content as much as I used to, but it's a kind of an annoying thing, because when you go to save it, the post, or publish the post, it'll pop up and say, you have accessibility problems, review them now. And you have to review them. Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I
And
had to
then,
turn it off the other day because I was trying to write a post about how this example of picture is not good for accessibility, and the checker kept like flashing at me, trying to make me change my,
yeah,
this was the good example, this was the bad example, and the checker was getting very annoyed at me.
yeah.
Have you seen the whitehouse.gov website? And yeah, so that's
Really
WordPress, and a
nice
lot
job.
of WordPress folks contribute to that.
Yeah, sometimes there's kind of this, I don't know, prejudice or sort of preconceived notion that if you're going to make a site accessible, that it can't be pretty, and that's not true at all. I mean, if you go to our portfolio, you'll see a lot of pretty websites that are accessible. So
Yeah.
that's not true. The whitehouse.gov, that's beautiful.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool things that like the switching the contrast I thought was really cool, and the way they the way they presented it, rather, like just like a little toggle thing, and it's very smooth going between dark to light, and then also like the increasing of text, and then how the rest of the page lays out.
So some of those things are put in there by a plugin, and it's called and they're called like an overlay plugin. So like Accessibility and Userways, those are two. And what those do is your content is there and it has its accessibility problems, and these plugins or services come in and fix them over the surface, and or put in a little side thing. So a couple things about that. One is sometimes those overlay plugins create more problems than they don't fix everything, and sometimes they create more problems. And even the things like the increasing the font size, Mike, if a person has a visual disability and they're used to zooming, they already have their own zooming tool.
They already have that stuff in tool. Yeah,
it really doesn't help those folks. It's really about look at us, we're being accessible. It can be, right?
Right. No, that's absolutely true. But also on top of what you said earlier, it's like, and this is true, is tackling accessibility from the beginning rather than as an afterthought, saves so much time in the long run, just by following best practices, and just going with that plan in mind, that we're like, this is how we're going to be accessible, and these are the things that we're going to do in order to do that.
Yeah, I just finish up with one thing about the overlays though, and that is some of those services are pricey. And so what you need to know is they don't fix anything on your site permanently. They just mask it. And those problems will come back the moment you stop paying for the plugin. That's one thing. And two, there are increasing, just in the last couple of months, we've had some pretty big articles come out that they talk about they will keep you compliant and keep you from being sued. But if you read the fine print, they do not promise that. And they will not go to court with you. And you're the user, those little terms of agreement that we all just sort of say we read, but we didn't. Part of that is you absolve them of any liability. And so just be careful. The best use case for those overlays is when you have big problems and you want to put that up there temporarily while you're getting the rest of it all fixed.
Gotcha. So like as a stopgap. Got it. Yeah. Cool. All right, so we have currently we have 7 questions, and as this usually happens, we start with 7, and then people ask more and more and more. So we'll see how this goes. But we're only an hour in, so
we're good.
We're all good. Okay, so first one from an anonymous attendee. If someone hires you for ADA, how do you guarantee that something that failed passes all audits for every screen reader that is out there?
You can't. I mean, at one level, you can't, right? And it's like making your website responsive for every single phone and mobile device on everything, right? There's no way that I can make my site, mobile responsive on a, some bizarre phone from 10 years ago, right? It may not. And so it's really that sort of a thing that you're really aiming for the big, getting close and continually improving as you can. And so, but I think the underlying question is well, correct me if I'm wrong. If I hire somebody to fix the ADA problems, how do I know if they're fixed? Is that part of the question?
I guess, yeah. I think it's like, I think you did answer the question. It's like, it's impossible to hit like, if you ever designed an email, like an HTML email and trying to get it to work for every email client, it's nearly impossible, but you try to go after the big ones, you do the best you can.
And it's important. It's important to note that, the WCAG and the 503C stuff, the ADA stuff is all suggestions. They're guidelines. They're not actually set in stone rules.
So they're not. Those guidelines are not. But increasingly, the court cases are coming down on the case that these are the standards that we're going toward. And so while they're not law, that's where things are heading, and that's going to be the best that you're going to do at this point, right? Is following those guidelines.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, right. And in the end, if you're in a lawsuit regarding this stuff, it's like, again, these are all guidelines. They're not actual law yet. So
no, but your stuff has to work. It has to work for people with disabilities.
It does have to work. It does have to work. And what it boils down to is, in the case of the Domino's case, Domino's basically said, no, we're not going to do it. And they got fined up the wazoo. They were fined millions of dollars.
It's crazy. Like, how many people with disabilities would want to order pizza? Why would you not make your app work for people with disabilities? That's just sort of like, and I don't know, that they were making a political point, I think, more than anything.
Yeah. I mean, that goes to your point about people living independently without help and stuff like that. Like that's why these things need to be exist. If
exactly. And depending on your niche or business, you do have some much higher kind of legal requirements for some things. So if you are in banking, if you are if people pay their bills on your site, if some of those kinds of functionalities, you have a much higher kind of
insurance agencies.
Right. So why didn't you pay your mortgage? Because your site's not accessible. That's well, that's a way to say that's why your site should be accessible, because people want to give you lots of money for your mortgage.
I mean, I would argue that a lot of the banking sites are not accessible to most people. I mean, they're horrible. They're hard to use, bad UX. But
that's a whole other story. That's
a UX panel in itself.
What's also interesting too is you start to look at it too. A lot of the things that are good for accessibility also are good for SEO. Yep. So when people start going, I don't know, it's like, hopefully they would be on board with embracing accessibility for the reasons that Bet outlined. But there's also a huge tie-in with search engine optimization. Everybody wants their site to rank higher. You get the alt text on those images, intelligent alt text that makes sense. You get headers going in correctly in hierarchical order with good content. That's SEO magic going on right there. So a lot of the different things, it just leads to more web traffic. Hello, there's SEO again. All of this interrelates very much so.
Yeah. We were talking briefly about some of those businesses and niches that are required. One of the pieces is around that gets sometimes gets lost or people don't know is if the entity, so like a nonprofit, if nonprofits are exempt from ADA, they don't even have to make their bathrooms accessible, right? They're exempt. But if they get any kind of federal money, if they take federal funding for anything. So if it's a nonprofit, but they're getting federal grants or state grants in a lot of states, they're getting federal and state money to do an after school program or to do a blah, blah, blah program. They have to be, their website, to the extent that it has any kind of interaction with that program, has any kind of information about it, any kind of applications with it, that all has to be accessible.
Right. Cool. Awesome. Let's get to another question. Rena asks, can a modal have an H1?
Oh, you're asking technical stuff. I don't think so.
He had it in the demo in the video, which I looked at that and I was like,
Technically,
why is
they
there
can.
an H1? I looked at it going,
You
why
can
is it
put one.
H1 there? I did
Yeah.
question that when I saw that. I was wondering if he was just doing that for a demo purpose. I wondered when I saw that. It shouldn't, not really.
Yeah, I'm
I
thinking
mean, technically you can, but
Yeah.
you
I mean,
should
I
use
could
it.
also jump off a building. That doesn't
Yeah,
mean
that's
that I
right.
should do it.
I mean, there's
Yeah.
3 feet of snow. You're probably gonna be okay. No.
Yeah, right. But
Oh, I
yeah,
thought you had 5 feet of snow.
yeah.
It's close. It is. My daughter and I jumped tunnels. So we have, it's enough snow to dig tunnels.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a lot. Okay. Here's another one. Anonymous attendee asks, do tables need to have descriptions and alt text?
They need to have proper row headers and column headers. So you need to if you, and you can Google this and you can find, there's tons of stuff on the internet about how to do this, make things accessible. But yes, they need to have proper labels for the columns and the rows. And so if you've ever built out a table in HTML, it will have these. And the thing that you may not know or may not think about is that these things that we're talking about, accessibility in terms of headings and table table and row column things and all, these apply to things like Word docs and Excel sheets, as well as at PDFs, all of this. And that's where a lot of people start to have, like our big water district client produces these ginormous 58-page reports with tons of graphs and charts that they are not entirely being accessible about, right? And so we want to make sure that you're thinking about other types of documents besides your web as well.
There's a whole art to making PDFs accessible, and I've done it a couple of times. But one of our members, Howard, has a lot of experience doing that. So if you want to reach out to him, he can walk you through some of the basic steps he does regarding making PDFs accessible.
Yeah. And there are some accessibility tools in things like Adobe and in Word. And so you can turn those on, and some little checker tools can help guide you as well.
Awesome. Cool. Next question, anonymous attendee asks, in the tables, shouldn't all headers read as headers and then correlate with content in the table?
Yeah, if you build out the table with correct HTML, so that you've got the table header things and all the, it's been a long time since I've done that actually. We don't build those out by hand anymore too much, right? But if you have all of it correctly done, and you can validate it in a HTML validator or something, but as long as it validates correctly, it'll be fine for the screen reader. And we should just say, you should really only use tables for data, right? That's a data thing.
Tabular
You're not going to
data.
lay out
Yeah.
content in tables, right?
Yeah.
Don't lay
That's
out
a
any
column.
Not
content.
1999 anymore, folks. No
Exactly.
more table-based layouts. It's really hard in mobile. I remember actually having like a plugin to where we took a table-based layout and made it work for mobile. It was horrendous. This is like right when we were making it's horrible. Okay. Alicia asks, is the nonprofit exemption countrywide or differ per state? I'm in California, so basically she's asking if it's a state thing or a federal thing.
It's a national thing. So nonprofits are not required to comply with ADA, except when they do some things where there are kind of public access things, right? So if you have a federal grant to do an after-school program, there's some kind of non-discrimination policy that you have to adhere to, right? So it's the same thing with your website, right? You're not required, but you may if you're taking any kind of federal funding.
Yeah. or or in order to get that program, you have to make your website accessible, or you cannot qualify for said program. There's also
Right.
that kind of chicken and egg thing
Right.
going on too.
But
Yeah,
particularly
I would say
anything related to the information about the program or the application for the program.
yeah, your school websites, government websites, town websites, those all need to be accessible.
Oh,
if
yeah.
you're a private school, a little different, because it's a little different, but
Yep, that's right.
in most cases, you're going to want to be accessible anyway. So,
but it's kind of like sometimes it's really murky and you have to do some digging to figure this out, right, Karen? Because they could be a private college, but if you have students who are getting federal Pell Grants,
that's right.
then you're getting federal money. So
That's right.
so it sometimes gets kind of tricky, and your best bet is to consult with an attorney.
Right, and there's lots of federal websites that are not accessible. I mean, they're just horribly built websites that were made 20, 25 years ago that they're horrible to use. And I know there's a department inside the U.S. The U.S. Digital Services team has been tackling a lot of these problems, and they're the team that rebuilt the WhiteHouse.gov site and launched it the day Joe Biden took office. I think that's being one of the lead people there is Andrew Nason, who's a longtime WordPress.
Yeah, Nason did. Helen
support.
did it. Some other folks from 10 Up. Jorben did it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Jorben. Yep.
So
yeah,
there's a lot of high level WordPress people working hand in hand with USDS and getting some of these big federal websites ported over to, if not WordPress, over to solutions that allow for accessibility.
right.
In some cases, like the healthcare.gov site is accessible, and that's one that I don't know if it's on WordPress, but I know that same team built it.
I skipped over a question on accident. I marked it live on accident. I apologize. Jack's question was, could you comment? He posted a URL, wave.webaim.org. Are you familiar with that tool?
Yeah. Okay.
Do you have any comments about that?
Yep. Hang on. Let me launch my browser because I shut that down to.
And then, because I think he had a follow-up question too on just sometimes you may get like a false positive on that, or just kind of speak in general about how that functions or doesn't function, I guess.
So wave.webaim.com. So there are all kinds of like, whoops.
I think it's .org.
Oh, .org. You're right.
Yeah.
Trying to talk and type. Okay, so you can put your website in here. There's also, if you are a developer and you want to do this, there's also a browser extension that'll let you do this on any site. And so if we go to, well, let's just do whitehouse.gov. And we, let's see, you could do it either way, but I'll just pull here and show how people would do it mostly. You can do, it didn't like that. That's interesting. Let's try, see what happens over here. Oh, here we get it. Okay, so you get this kind of a little report over here. What you need to know is that these automated checkers only catch somewhere between 30 and 35% of accessibility issues. So it's a great place to begin to identify some issues, but this just passing the WebAIM tool is not going to make you 100% accessible. Part of that is because a lot of things require manual testing. And our lead developer has some other different tools that she likes to do, but this is a great one, for example, looking at color contrast. So there's one place here where color contrast is not going, and so you would look here. Oops. And now I can't see where it is, right on that little thing, huh? Well,
is it the blue links across the blue sky?
It's right here, I think. I think it's showing up that I think it was this, right? The white text over the image, because all the automated checker can do is look at the difference between them, but it doesn't know where to pick anything. And so it's looking at the difference between the white here and the white in the background in the lightest part of it. And so it's giving you probably what's a false positive. So you may have false positives and you may have false negatives. There may be things that doesn't catch, and there may be things that it says are problems that really aren't.
Yeah.
Right?
Like
And
that
so-
font, if that went down, like right now, that's, I don't know what, like 0.30
bad.
maybe. It's a pretty big font. But if that went down to say 10, then I think size is helping the
Right.
situation there if it went down, and that maybe the tool is not discerning size being a factor. In other words,
I'm
Right.
curious.
saying.
I'm curious how it looks on mobile, because that would probably, the font size probably will go down.
Yeah. Whoops, we said that, didn't like it. I'm trying to remember. Did we look at styles, WebAIM, details? It'll show you some things, very low contrast. It'll show you what these things are. See there, no.
It's still
Yeah.
pretty big on mobile. I just did it.
Jack said, I have seen it complain about text as an overlay, had to add a separate background or a color background to the text itself, the same
Well-
as the box color behind it.
Yeah, so notice how they darkened, they made the filter over this image of the White House, right? So
Yeah,
so
they
it's
did
pretty
overlay that.
dark to contrast with the white. And I'm sure they did that for making it accessible.
Legible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, even just
exactly.
legible. I mean, the thing is, even
Well-
if you, it's easier for me to read, and and I'm sure like many other people, as we said, as we kind of said that like accessibility is also better usability. So.
Right. Cool.
Cool. Sandra says, or Sandra, in the U.S., there's also Section 508 of the U.S. Rehabilitation Act, in addition to the ADA as legislation, correct?
Right. Yes. So Section 508 has to do with government websites. So as Cameron was mentioning, if you are federal, state, local, county, city, all of those things are covered. Oh, well, the federal stuff, any kind of federal related things, and any kind of federal pieces are covered by what's called Section 508. And it's similar. It has similar kind of guidelines. Uses a lot of that same language, but it's technically Section 508 if it's government. And then there are a lot of states, for instance, the state of California, that basically say, for the state of California, you have to follow Section 508. Right, so they just piggyback onto that. And so there are a lot of states in which, if you're state and anything related to the state. And so when I say anything related to the state, it's like, the state of Oregon, the Secretary of State, down to every website of every legislator, to the different kind of subsidiary organizations. So the Oregon Federation for the Blind, to anybody that's getting that money, and anybody that's getting funding from that. So if you are for example, a defense contractor, your website ought to be compliant. So,
Cool. Alicia follows up. I think the font issue on the .gov site, the whitehouse.gov site, is due to overlay in CSS, and it's not picked up by Wave, so it doesn't know it's got an overlay.
maybe.
Could be.
Yeah,
So that's a possibility.
entirely possible.
Cool. Anonymous user asks, or anonymous attendee asks rather, I wanted to ask about pop-ups and other intrusive opt-in features. How do the reader programs handle these kind of things? Are there browser add-ons or mobile options for more streamlined browsing experience? This is actually a really good question.
It's a great question, because they can be a huge problem. There are a couple of we have utilized Pop-Up Maker, the plugin Pop-Up Maker, and they work pretty hard to make that one accessible. But then again, when you make the pop-up, you have to pay attention to the content inside the pop-up, right? So it's not just the pop-up, but they can be a big problem. It's not the most user-friendly in terms of people with disabilities.
Well, and some you get trapped in, like it's literally a keyboard trap. Once you're in it, you're not getting out. Like you have to exit the web. Like some of them are a
there
trap.
are actually a bigger problem for the keyboard. I mean, some of those are keyboard traps, but bigger problem for keyboard traps is some of the more specialized search plugins. And once you tab into that search, you can't get out of it.
That's a huge thing. So I work in publishing. So a lot of our stuff, like there's a lot of like ad tech and such around there that I can only imagine it's crap code to begin with. I can't imagine any of it being very accessible because it
All the advertisements.
slows down. Yeah, slows down your sites.
Oh, they're horrible.
I mean,
Yeah.
We've had so many issues with weird things, and it's always an ad.
Yeah, we're doing in the last year and a half or so. We've been doing more audits for food blogs. We got connected with a community of food bloggers, and they had a pretty well-known food blogger, maybe almost 2 years ago now, who was sued, and so they're all really like anxious about trying to be compliant. But yeah, those ads are a big. Every site for food blogger we've audited has huge problems with, and the ad companies will swear it's all fine. And in fact, just today, people are emailing and asking because the ad company says that is removing. So a lot of times on some of those inserted ads, there's like a little X, and you can click to like close that one, right? Another one pops out, but close that one.
Yeah.
And then they're talking about in the case of a video, and it's automatically playing. And it's like, oi, well, technically speaking, auto playing videos are okay as long as there's a mechanism to shut them off, as long as there are captions, if there's voice there or some kind of transcript for it, and 3, if it's oh wait, no, I'm sorry, I'm just going to blank it on my captions, and then no strobing or flashing that might, with its auto playing, that there's no strobing or flashing that might induce seizures. And so they're like, well, okay, it's only going to play, it's ever going to be at the bottom, and there will be some kind of a pause mechanism on it. But auto playing videos is kind of it's kind of like, just because you're technically allowed to do something doesn't mean you should.
You should, yeah.
And so we say, generally speaking, you shouldn't autoplay videos unless it's like a no sound background image at the top of a page. It's like a background, right?
How do you? Okay.
Which then kills your site load time. Like I know a couple of times, sometimes people have like, oh, I really love this drone shot that's going to be the first thing to load as my website comes up, and yeah.
I could also imagine paywalls being an interesting accessibility issue, especially ones that like kind of pop up with JavaScript, where like the content's available for a second and then it kind of like.
Oh yes, you do have to investigate that stuff. It depends on what kind of paywall you're using and what.
Hard paywalls, I assume, are probably pretty straightforward because the content's never accessible to begin with.
Yeah, you just got to
through the process.
Page, essentially.
But then there's a lot of things like I think New York Times changed their paywall. I think they're more closer to a hard paywall, but
WAPO I hit all the time.
Some of them are like, if you know a thing or two about a website and you can just remove the paywall if you really want to read the article, you could.
You mean how I go to an incognito browser when I really want to see that?
Yeah, but even if they get smart about that, like turning off the overflow hidden, getting rid of all the paywall markup.
Well, I didn't even do that technically. I just sort of say, did I see this?
But I'm just saying, like that stuff, like thrown in there, the content's technically there, but then if it loads up and then the JavaScript loads up, how do you change where things
I said
are
at the
to make sure
beginning,
that
I am not the technical person, and some of these things get into very nichey little kind of pieces. So those kinds of things, I'm sure there are tons of people that know a lot about them, but I haven't actually heard too many people talk about them.
But I can see that be a huge thing, if especially like 25%, like being like, that like having like going through that funnel of getting to paywall. Yeah.
The other thing I'm thinking of, as you were mentioning the food bloggers, is how, we were kind of helping them with accessibility, and there is that recipe blog thing that if you, so you can have a plugin that's accessible until you circumvent it. I'll let Bet tell this story.
So there is apparently a recipe plugin that almost all these food bloggers use, WP Recipe Maker, and almost all of them use it. And when you put in the recipe, you the plugin developer very helpfully provided the little buttons in the interface for using the fractions and and the abbreviate
quarter cup, third of a cup, eighth of a cup,
right,
whatever,
Oh,
one,
wow.
third, right,
whatever
all
it
the
would
little
be,
fractions.
right?
But people have the little space for putting in the quantity, and what they were doing was just typing in 1/4, right? And instead of using the little button. And so then when the screen reader was going to do that, and it was a cup, the screen reader was reading 1.4 Cuban pesos.
Oh, man.
Because so you're reading 1.4
no.
Cuban pesos of butter. It's like, whoa. So you have to, it's about educating people about they have to do
Yeah.
things even like that, right? You have to
Yeah,
be
don't circumvent the accessible plugin.
That's amazing.
right.
Cool. Before there's no more questions, but if anybody has any that they want to ask before we kind of
Just bring up,
Go
I
ahead.
think Cam put it in the chat earlier, which I didn't know because I'm not a Mac person. Cam, you were talking about there's some tools that are
Yeah,
great in Mac.
Mac OS 10 has had accessibility, like text to speech stuff built into the OS 10 for like 15 years. If you go to system preferences and then click on accessibility, where's that at? No, I'm looking for myself. Click on the accessibility icon. You can turn on speech and you can turn on dictation. So you can actually voice control your computer, and you can have your computer speak text and read text from whatever screen it's on.
Oh, and you can do that on your phone too.
Yep, it's built into iOS as well.
Well, iOS and Android as well, and you could do that.
Yep.
And then it's it's really cool what people are able to do. And so I played with that. I turned it on my phone, or I turned it on at one time. And then there's some kind of a gesture that I have an iPhone. There's some kind of a gesture that you can do on it, but I don't remember what it is. But occasionally I will enable it by accident.
Yeah, I've done that too. I don't remember what it is. I don't remember what that is either, but I know there is. It's happened to me a few times.
And just to kind of comment a little bit, I don't know if you noticed that when Mark Sutton was doing that thing with the screen reader, and initially it was just going super fast. People who use screen readers, like when I listen to podcasts, I'm often on like 1.5 because it doesn't sound too chipmunky, but I can still understand it, and it's going by. People who use screen readers are routinely on 4 and 5, and it's just like, but it's like if you regularly do that and you build it up, you just learn, your brain learns to listen fast.
Wow.
And
it's like people who read books for a living. They're reading 2 or 3 novels a day, but they're reading them 3 or 4 times as fast as the normal person.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's incredible.
The neuroplasticity stuff is just amazing. What we are all capable of, and what people do. But
so Jack Kleinfeld has another question. He says, please discuss disabilities other than visual a little more.
Yeah.
Yep.
So anytime we're talking about mobility disabilities, so I can't use a mouse. Maybe I'm paralyzed from the neck down. Maybe I have cerebral palsy. You want to make sure that you're using, making sure those headings are up there. That's that person that is able to voice control or keyboard control their things are going to use headings a lot more. Other disabilities, we want to make sure anytime there's anything related to sound on your site, we don't have a huge number of sites that do sound at this point in terms, except for playing videos. So that's where we tend to focus when we're talking about accessibility, is on captions on videos or a transcript of the video. And I got to tell you, we mentioned a number of times now, these things will make your site more usable for everybody. There are studies that show that on social media platforms like LinkedIn and LinkedIn and Facebook, that 80% of users watch videos with the sound off and depend on the captions.
I was gonna mention this. We had
And
Aaron
so-
Jorbin do this, do a similar talk, but the accessibilities you don't think about, like the mother with the baby in her hand, like a person in a
Yeah.
quiet library who forgot their headphones, those sort of things are.
Well, I
all
routinely,
under accessibility.
I wake up and I'm waiting in a waiting room, or I don't want everybody to hear what's going on my phone, or don't have my headset with me. I'm
Yeah.
just kind of,
I used to have a no headphone rule at the former job. I had a we had a no headphone rule. So you couldn't put headphones on to listen to things. So it was just like my sound was off all day because I never knew when I was going to hit something and then I needed to watch, whatever I needed to watch. Yeah.
yeah. In terms of other disabilities, there is increasing, those are the big ones that people have focused on initially around accessibility, but increasingly we're looking at things like ADHD, people with reading disabilities. So Mike mentioned his thing about kerning, but you want to, for instance, make sure that you never use full width justification on your text. It creates what's called rivers of white, right? As the words are spaced differently apart, and you have these rivers of white, hugely distracting to people with reading disabilities. It makes it almost impossible sometimes for them to get through the content. You want to, we're thinking more about things like intellectual disabilities, right? Do you, it's one thing if you are you are one of our clients is the Southwestern Association of Anthropology, right? They're anthropology professors, right? They're doing research. We expect their website content to be written at a, college level at
Postdoctoral
least,
level. Yeah.
right? Maybe not postdoctoral, but you'd be surprised how many of them have trouble following directions, although. So, but,
It's true.
but if it's a banking site, you need to be writing the average reading level in the United States is maybe like 6th or 7th grade. You need to be writing below that, right?
A good tool to learn about reading levels is there's an educational website called Newsella, which basically publishes the same news articles at like 5 different reading levels. And so you can go in and you can look, okay, what are 2nd graders understanding? What are 5th graders understanding? And what are 12th graders understanding? All the same article. It's a great website. Yeah. It's a tool educators use a lot. It's called Newsella.
And some of it is even just kind of stylistically breaking people from doing other things that's a little more old school. There's lots of times that I will get content in and I'm like, oh my God, put down the italics before we get hurt. The over italics.
Stop using the word whereas.
Yes, too much italics, too much bold, or that people don't understand the difference between a bold and italic is not the same thing as a header. It's wildly different. You are not getting the mileage. You are not getting the accessibility out of that. People do not understand that does not work.
And can I just tell people, please stop linking the word click here. I mean,
that's a bad one.
That's a huge one.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's
natural text.
Even 20 years later, it's still like click here. I'm like, no, make the whole sentence.
Let me say a little bit about why that's bad. So one of the things that we've learned, we recently sent our lead developer to do screen reader training with the instructor from the contractor from the Oregon Federation for the Blind. So she did screen reader training. One of the kind of insights for her was, there's one thing to sort of like download the screen reader, figure out how it works, like see what it's saying about things. But when somebody who's using a screen reader day in and day out goes to the site, they really don't read just like the sighted people who visit. They're not reading every word. They're skimming through it by jumping from header to header and from link to link. So if they're jumping through your links and your headers,
click here.
It just says click here, and it just reads out that text. And if all of your links say click here, guess what they're not doing? They're not clicking on any of them.
Here's the other one that's like that too, is also learn more. People sometimes are tuned into the click here. The other bugaboo on that is learn more. And yeah, that's another big one too.
I have a question for you on that. The click here. Sometimes the click here could be more visually appealing just for the website. Would some meta on the link help? Meaning if the text says click here, but there's a title tag that actually says a title attribute that, or some sort of aria that says what it is, the click here
again,
is.
you can do that, but that's not really best practice.
Okay.
Gotcha. Because it's not just people who are using the screen readers that's for, right?
Yeah.
If you think about somebody with ADHD going through, they're really just scanning for those things visually too, but you're wanting to like help them understand what will happen when I click this link.
So basically you want to fight against designs where like the design has a button that says click here.
Yeah,
I mean the way
that I've kind of gotten around it on a couple of sites that are under my control that I do, like we have a couple of events going on, and one of them is, we want them to sign up and register. Anytime we have a call for action, at this point, it is always a button. We have made a decision that if it is a call to action, end of statement, it is a button, and then it's always click this button to register for whatever the name of the thing is we want you to do. Like, this is sort of the executive decision we made with it. And then anything else is just inline text, learn more about this project, that isn't really like, like I said, I mean, yeah, it's a call to action, but it's not
this ebook on blah, 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 right?
Right. Or a full
It sounds like you need to get, in addition to getting developers on board with accessibility, designers need to be very on board with accessibility when it comes to
developers, designers, content creators. All three have parts to play in the accessibility.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's actually in terms of developing sites and then it's kind of like once you turn it over and the content creators, even when they're supposed to be doing it, sometimes don't, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a legal liability to be compliant, then you're probably going to want to be having your content audited on a regular basis just to make sure you're maintaining.
Just like you don't grab Google images from Google and put them up on your site. Because that ends up being sued for a lot of money.
It's bad.
Same idea.
Thing, right?
Yeah. There's a couple other questions in the Q&A. Cognitive or reading disabilities are helped by accessibility too. That was more a comment than a question. Jack asks, is full justification okay on short text like headers? I guess as opposed to a paragraph like text.
I would say no. I mean, if it wraps down to another line, but why would, as long as it's maybe one line and you're not creating those rivers, I guess. But even then it creates uneven spacing.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem, is that spacing that's uneven gets really distracting for some folks.
Right.
And what does that look like on mobile? Does that just look crazy on mobile once it goes to mobile?
I don't know. I've never tried to do that stuff. Generally, you want to just do everything left justified.
Yeah, I've had people ask, like, oh, can we justify like this? I go, no. No, it's bad. It looks bad. It's not a newspaper.
The other things that we didn't talk about in terms of other disabilities, we are trying to think more about people with depression, people with anxiety disorders.
What kind of things do we talk about with people with those disorders?
So it has to do with making things clear, and I know what's going to happen. You're asking me to click this button. Do I know? Am I really sure what's going to happen when I do that? Right? Knowing the steps of a process, knowing how long it's going to take, using the little bars at the top to show how far. If it's a really long form, for instance, giving people a kind of a reassurance that it's along the way. And
like
people with depression often can't sustain energy for a long time, right? And so you want to think about, how hard do you make it to find stuff, right? How many clicks does it take, right? And all of those are great for all the rest of us for usability too, but it's also a part of that knowing where things are going. And,
that's another thing I didn't really think about, people with like depression, anxiety.
Well, there's also, I'm thinking people also with like seizure disorders too. Like we hit a graphic earlier today too, that the blinking on it, I mean, I don't have a seizure disorder.
Yesterday. Oh my God.
And this like swirly tech, I was like, is this bothering anybody else? And then we realized I was seeing it at a very high, like it was blown up 10 times bigger than it was going to be. I'm like, okay, fine. If it's going to be this big, it's not going to bother me. But rapid moving graphics, you hear those stories sometimes that people will go to a movie theater and all of a sudden there's a, you know, a fight sequence with a lot of flashing lights and stuff, and they have people in the movie theaters that get triggered into like an epileptic kind of seizure. That happens on websites too. You got to think about how many blinky bright things do you have going, and do you really need those, you know?
How do you, especially since the two you sell, like, you know, basically have websites for all sorts of clients and with accessibility in mind, you know, you have the clients that like, they want like an edgier website, they want something like that, which is not like an accessible practice. How do you sell them? How do you like, I guess, have them take a step back from that and then like apply what they want, but also accessible? And how do you like kind of go
It's
about
an
that?
art. It's an art. It's not always
There it is.
successful. It's not always successful, but you know, some things with accessibility are going to be theme related that they won't have any knowledge about whether it's accessible or not. Does it have skip links to skip to the content? Other things they will. You know, you're not, and we're not always successful. I don't like to do the fear mongering thing, but you know, for instance, we have a client today. We're on kind of a rush with this project, and one of their main button colors is not accessible. We gave them some choices, and they said, you know, I think we're going to stick with the other. And I'm thinking, well, do I pull out the "you could be sued"? I'm thinking actually my
Hold harmless.
Yep, exactly. That's where I'm going. I am going to come back with, okay, but I'm going to need you guys to sign this release that we warned you that this was not going to be accessible, and we are not going to be a part of any lawsuit you have over that, because their website is a SaaS platform that people will be coming to. So it's not like,
It's,
you know, that's more problematic for them.
Right.
And so some of it is weighing those, like, how likely are they to get sued? And you know, I want them to definitely sign off that we told you specifically that these colors were not going to. If it comes up that that's a part of the lawsuit, we're in the clear, right?
And sometimes that's all it takes too, is just pointing out, yeah, no problem. I just need you to sign here to hold me harmless. You know, that makes, you know, the point at which somebody else is saying, I need you to sign that you're not going to sue me when you do get sued, just suddenly takes it into a whole new realm.
Right. It becomes not like like, oh, well, it's no big deal. It's like, oh, well, they don't. Yeah.
Yep.
Totally.
So that's where we'll be going next, I think, with these books. But, you know, it's, again, Mike, it's kind of more of an art, and it's, you know, part of it is having those conversations up front from the very beginning.
Right.
And, you know.
And sometimes just educating too. The one I think we didn't mention either, Bet, is the top level menu items, how that, if they're empty, how that creates an issue too, because that's a lot of like older styling, and people like, but I've seen a website that does this, and it's like, well, we've also probably seen rickety porches falling off houses. It doesn't mean I'm going to put up a new one like that, you know?
Yeah. So what Laura's talking about is where you can put you can put an empty menu item up at the top with like a hashtag. And so it doesn't really go anywhere. But it holds, it's like a placeholder.
It's like for a drop. It's like for a drop down.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like a placeholder for all of the sub pages that are underneath.
What are you supposed to do with those?
Well, you're not supposed to have them. So it's educating the client about, that's terrible for screen readers. That's terrible for SEO. It's terrible for
they should link
right?
somewhere.
Yeah, it's god awful for SEO.
How does that work with mobile though? So I guess on like, because the thing is that the gestures are different on mobile or
wait, when you're opening up an accordion, like a drop down on it?
Yeah.
Well,
I guess you would just return, like you wouldn't actually go somewhere.
Press it twice, or a long tap or something on a lot of them.
Okay.
It's not a problem on mobile.
Okay. I was just curious because I'm like not even 100% sure, like because I still see people doing the little hash and.
Yep.
So I learned something today.
Yeah. Cool.
10 years of bad habits.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
But there's always something you learn, like every day. I mean, for me, the biggest wake up to accessibility was when I was just starting to realize how much it was tied to SEO. And I just remember thinking, you know, bringing that factor in, and what will, you know, what do you have to do to tell somebody to sell them on getting it, and eventually they'll get it. You know,
Yeah.
it's a lot of that, and just seeing also a lot of where it's going to is voice search. Um,
Yeah.
you know, that is a lot of the voice search that's coming down the pike is all related to accessibility items. And, you know, how many of us go, "Hey, Alexa," and ask Alexa to go do something?
Right.
Right.
It's all related to accessibility.
Right. I
Cool.
see that Jack is asking a question about the empty menu item, and it's still bad. Yeah. Because the screen reader is looking for the link, and it reads out the link, and so then it's not reading anything. Google sees that there's nothing there. It's just
Oh, so an anchor link. So an anchor. No, well, I think he's asking like if it's hash title, that would take you to an anchor. So the idea would be there would be an like some sort of tag with an ID on that. So for instance, if you have a header, like a header that says like, I don't know, whatever
that you're going
that.
further down the page. There are ways
Yeah.
to do that,
Mhm.
but you do need to be. They're not the most accessible thing, and you need to
Okay.
pay attention to how you put them together.
Okay. Because I thought that was pretty common. Like that's a like an index usually works
More of a
that way.
landing page kind of thing
Yeah,
that goes
and
down.
like tag goes
There-
down, sometimes it's smooth, sometimes it just takes
Yeah,
you down there,
yeah.
that sort of thing.
There
That's
are
okay
ways
though.
to do that. There are
Mhm.
ways to do that accessibly, but it
Mm.
involves doing some stuff with remind me, Laura. It's like in some of the tags. I think our developer does
Meg
them.
would know it better than me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
There are some ways to do them accessibly, but you have to pay attention to how you do it. It's not just
Okay.
throwing something up.
Let me know because I'm curious because that's a
Okay.
big thing. That's a big one. I'm
Okay.
gonna mark that one answered. There's a couple other ones in here. Jack also asked, you said that the tools only find 35% of the issues and manual testing is necessary. What's involved in manual testing?
Oh, that's a great question. When we do an audit for a client, we start out with the automated tools. So we're using things like the the Wave tool. We're using Axe Lighthouse, and looking at errors for there, and that gives us a beginning stage of some of the things that might be wrong. But then we're going through. We offer so a couple ways you could do audits. One is looking at every single page of a site, but if they have 1,000 posts, that's kind of hugely expensive. We do what we call a sampling audit. So we ask the client to pick 25 URLs over the whole of the site, trying to get a representative sample of the content. So it might be a few posts and some pages, some different authors, maybe some different templates. And then we're going to the page and we use a screen reader to go through it. We're looking for things. We look globally for some things with the menu or the search box or the sidebars and those kinds of things. But then we're just going through every single page as if we were a disabled person using the keyboard and the screen reader.
Cool. Kimberly asked, do you make it a point to include people with disabilities on your team?
We don't have people full-time on our team now with disabilities, but we have some people who are with disabilities who are consultants to us, that when we run into issues or have questions about how something is working or how they might be navigating something that looks a little different that we haven't seen before, we often will ask for them to come in as a consultant in that way. Yeah.
Cool. An anonymous attendee has checked my website and some WordPress plugin built-in elements are coming up as error or has no alt. What do I do then? I guess I'm not sure.
Well, it will depend on what those things are.
Yeah.
So we would, yeah.
I guess if it's something that has read the page, it's kind of identifying what is missing, like if there's alt text missing and
Yeah,
making
so-
sure that you add that alt text in there,
Well,
making sure
one of the
that
things that are like typically we'll see sometimes there'll be like a plugin that's putting social media icons in a widget.
Mm,
Maybe it doesn't have the alt text on the icons or something like that.
right.
And sometimes there's some ways to do that, and then sometimes it's just picking a different plugin.
Right, or just
And that's
following up,
true
or
for-
just or reporting it to the plugin you're using if it's a
Right,
WordPress
you could certainly do
plugin,
that.
and
You could
see if
certainly do that.
they comply
And
to
then
it.
that's true with themes too. So one of the things that you want to look for is whether your site has what are called skip links. So if you go to the site and you start hitting the tab button, some of the very first things that should appear in the upper left-hand corner are called skip to content, skip to menu, skip to navigation, skip to content. And that lets them skip over the menu, for example. Otherwise, as you'll discover if you start hitting your tab, you've got to tab through every single thing at the top of the website, right? And take a long time. And so if you don't have a skip to links like that, pretty much it doesn't make any sense to try and remediate that, really. You just need to pick a different theme,
Right.
or have a different theme developed, right?
Yeah.
An honest attendee asks, could we see some examples of bad sites or bad sites that aren't very accessible in horrendous ways?
I'm not thinking of any right off the top of my head.
This is also being recorded, so you might.
Yeah,
not-
it kind of
not
depends,
get
and
me
I'm not so
too,
sure any
right?
of them are going to want us to really
You
like
might
go down
not
that
wanna,
rabbit hole.
go down
Um,
that rabbit hole.
You know,
And
I'm
here's
sure,
the
like,
thing: if you're not disabled, it might look like a perfectly fine site, right?
This is
I like
true.
I like if you tab through the site and you don't go through things like in a nice flow, it's not a very accessible site to me.
I mean,
Like, I think that's the most obvious
I
way
was
to
gonna say,
kinda
I
do
mean,
it.
I have one that, I had a website that I did very quickly before I learned all about this, and it's the old story of the cobbler, the cobbler's,
Yeah.
the cobbler's children have no shoes.
Right.
There's horrible color contrast going on my website that I have to go fix. Like mine is newyorkerlaura.com. You would please do laugh at my menu. Yeah, it's really bad.
I built a website
And
for
I'm sure
someone
that
that
there's no
was
alt text on most of the images. I would bet you money there's no alt text
I-
on
Well,
most of the
you didn't
images.
know what you didn't know, right?
No, I
And
didn't know what I didn't
Yeah.
know at the time, and
and
I just have not really kept up to fix it. So
that's the
I built
thing,
a
right? No,
website-
learn and do better.
yeah,
I built a website for a friend of mine, and he's actually colorblind. So
Yeah.
he like, it was interesting working with a designer on that. He's like, I can't see that. I'm like, okay, then I guess we have to fix that. And it was like great to have that perspective like early on. And this was a couple of years before accessibility. So, but it was like a great little starter. Like wow, like, this is a real issue for people, and we
Totally.
should take it more seriously.
I forget who it
there's
was. I
some-
hit it with the color blindness on a button, and they're like, I can't tell that it's a button. I'm like, oh, we got to
Yeah.
change that color.
Like one of those
So
things.
there are
like,
some
uh-huh.
testers. There are some online testing tools that you can use for different types of testing for different types of color blindness, and those are pretty cool too.
Cool. Anne asks, is the word shop in the top navigation sufficient for screen readers?
Depends what it links to.
Well, does it like link to your WooCommerce shop? You mean? I would think.
I would
Yeah.
think that's probably fine. I mean, it should just be descriptive of what it is. And if the
Right.
person expects what is they land on, then
I would.
Right.
I mean, assuming you're about to purchase something, I
I
think
mean,
that's
if you
completely
can
fine.
see if you can see the word shop and you click on it and it takes you to a shop, like it's the same idea.
Yeah.
I would assume it's like it's the same thing.
Right, but just don't be kind of, once in a while we're working, you work with people who just want to be cutesy about things and not be normal. And so we've worked in the past with a lot of faith communities. And instead of saying worship, like you would know what that means, like worship, they want to say our gatherings.
Right.
What does that mean?
No, or
Right.
yes, joyfully come with us, or something. That was one of them one times too. And I thought, why? I'm not sure why we have an adverb here. It was.
Like, I don't know what I'm navigating.
Yeah, I just literally don't know
I
what this
I don't know
is.
what you're
Yes.
talking about, right? Yeah, exactly.
I mean, but that's a usability. I mean, I think that's not even accessibility. That becomes usability. It's like, I don't like. It doesn't matter what person it is. Like, I know this column I'm looking at.
Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, Alicia.
Alicia asks, if the button goes out to a third party, it shouldn't be within the navigation, but it can be adjacent to it.
Yeah. So anytime you have a link that's going off your website,
I have a follow-up for that too.
there is you really should notify people that it's taking them off the site. And there's a little plugin called Exit Noti. Is that the one we're using now, Orlo? Exit Notifier? I think it's right.
You're right.
And it automatically at the end of any link puts this little icon that like that you're leaving this site.
Thing, yeah.
Yeah. Except that here's your special offer for having me on the show. If you are using that, and it just applies it in line with the link. But our developer has this little CSS snippet for making it be superscript and smaller, but still accessible. So it looks prettier. Right? So
I have a follow-up to
share
that.
if you'd like.
What is your feelings on target blank, meaning opening up a new tab for offsite URLs? Like, so for instance, I heard it's bad. Like, I mean, and maybe it's just like not a general bad practice, but like you shouldn't really, if you're on the same site, because you lose the back button, the browser back if you open up on a new tab, and if you're blind, or like opening up a new tab could be something interesting.
And for example, you open in a new tab, but then you may not realize that you need to navigate to a new tab.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you usually have to manually click to go to that tab. Right.
Right.
So yeah, the general rule would be if it's a link within your own website, you just want to make sure it stays in that same tab or window.
Right.
If it's a link off your website, then you do want to make it open in a new window or tab.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, we have only 9 minutes left. I think that usually sometimes they go the full 2 hours, sometimes they don't. Like, it depends upon how active the questions are. Here we answered almost 30 questions. But yeah, Beth, this was great. Thank you for sharing. Accessibility is super important. I'm glad we're able to continually have these conversations about it, reinstate